The small town of Black Hollow had always been peaceful, a place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. That changed when the knocking began. It started as faint, sporadic raps on doors late at night, just loud enough to wake the residents, but soft enough to leave them questioning whether they'd imagined it. By the time Emily Carter, a journalist from the local paper, caught wind of the rumors, half the town was already on edge. Emily was a skeptic, dismissing the stories as collective hysteria or pranksters. Still, curiosity got the better of her, and she began interviewing the shaken townsfolk. Each account was the same: a knock at midnight, the creak of a floorboard, the chill of an unseen presence. Then, one night, while typing up her notes, she heard it, 3 sharp knocks on her own front door. Her heart pounded as she crept to the peephole, only to find the porch empty. The next night, the knocking returned, louder this time, as if whatever was outside was growing impatient. Neighbors whispered of the undead, of restless spirits walking among them. Emily scoffed, but when she heard the third night's knock, a thunderous bang that rattled her windows, even she couldn't deny that something unnatural was happening in Black Hollow. Emily's investigation led her to the town's crumbling library, where yellowed newspapers and forgotten journals hinted at a darker history. The librarian, an elderly woman with trembling hands, whispered about a graveyard on the outskirts of town, Black Hollow Cemetery. It was said that the dead there never slept, their restless spirits bound to the earth by a terrible injustice. That night, Emily followed the trail of knocking reports to the graveyard's rusted iron gates. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil and something fouler, like rotting flesh. As she stepped between the tilting headstones, the knocking echoed around her, though no living soul was in sight. Then, beneath the pale glow of the moon, she saw it, a single, freshly disturbed grave, the earth sunken as if something had clawed its way out. The name on the moss-covered stone was Samuel Vane. The dates were faded, but the epitaph was clear: wronged in life, vengeance in death. A cold breath hissed against Emily's neck, and the whispers began, voices murmuring Samuel's name, his rage, his hunger for retribution. He had been buried alive centuries ago, a victim of a town's treachery, and now he would make them pay. The knocking wasn't a plea for help, it was a warning. The knocking had grown worse. What started as faint taps had become deep, resonant thuds, each one rattling the doors like something desperate to get in. Emily woke every night to the sound, her pulse hammering as she'd stare at the trembling wood, too afraid to open it. But last night she saw the scratches, 3 jagged lines gouged into her front door, as though claws had raked across it. The townspeople whispered of the same thing: mirrors reflecting figures that weren't there, voices murmuring their names in empty rooms. Fear had tightened its grip on the town. Emily sought out David, the local historian, poring over brittle records in the dim light of his cluttered office. His hands trembled as he traced a passage in an old ledger, a record of executions centuries ago. Samuel hadn't been a criminal, but a man buried alive by mistake, cursing the town with his final, suffocated breath. Worse still, the full moon was approaching. David's voice dropped to a whisper. The dead don't rest when the moon is high. Samuel draws strength from it. That night, Emily watched, heart in her throat, as a shadow flickered in her hallway mirror. It turned its head, smiled. Then the whispering began again. This time it called her name. The knocking had become unbearable, a relentless, rhythmic thudding that echoed through the streets every night, growing louder with each passing hour. Sleep was impossible. The townspeople, once united in fear, now fractured into hysterical mobs. Some barricaded themselves indoors, while others roamed the streets, muttering to themselves, their eyes wild with terror. The local doctor's office overflowed with patients suffering from sleep deprivation and psychosis, their whispers of Samuel filling the air like a toxic fog. Emily and David, armed with fragments of lore and desperation, ventured into the cursed graveyard at dusk. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of dead leaves. They found Samuel's cracked and weathered headstone, the earth around it disturbed as if something had clawed its way out. With trembling hands, they began the ritual, a desperate incantation from an old journal David had unearthed. But as they recited the words, the wind howled, and the ground beneath them trembled. It was too late. The townspeople, those who hadn't vanished, arrived, their hollow eyes fixed on Emily and David. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if pulled by invisible strings. Samuel's laughter echoed through the graveyard, his spirit seizing control of the living. The possessed advanced, their mouths twisting into grotesque smiles. Emily and David ran, but the curse had already taken root. The town was no longer theirs. It belonged to the dead. The air was thick with the scent of burning sage as Emily and David knelt in the center of the abandoned church, their hands trembling as they recited the ancient incantation. The words felt foreign on Emily's tongue, but desperation drove her forward. Outside, the possessed townspeople, their eyes hollow, their movements jerky, scratched at the walls and doors, their guttural whispers growing louder with each passing second. David's voice remained steady, though sweat beaded on his forehead. The ritual required a sacrifice, and they both knew it. As the final words left their lips, the ground beneath them trembled, and a piercing shriek erupted from the darkness. Samuel's spirit writhed in agony, his form dissipating like smoke in the wind. But as the last echoes of the scream faded, Emily turned to find David collapsed on the floor, his chest still. The knocking ceased, and the townspeople fell like marionettes with cut strings. A year later, Emily sat in her quiet apartment, the events of that night etched into her nightmares. She had tried to move on, but the silence felt heavier than the fear. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, it came, a single, deliberate knock on her door. Her breath caught in her throat. The knocking had stopped. It was over, wasn't it? The knob began to turn slowly, and Emily's blood turned to ice. The last thing she heard was a familiar, rasping whisper calling her name before the room plunged into darkness.